Hey everyone, it's Melissa. Before we get started, I want to give a quick disclaimer that a portion of this episode contains discussions of depression, suicide, and other mental health disorders that may be triggering for some. If you find these topics uncomfortable to listen to, feel free to check out my other episodes, but if not, hope you learn a few things. All right, enjoy. Hey everyone, welcome to Happy Hour. My name is Melissa. I feel like I need to introduce myself before I jump into the episodes because I usually get so excited, but I'm not Emma Chamberlain or anything, so not a lot of you people know me yet. But my name is Melissa, and I'm so grateful that you're spending your time to listen to the show where I spotlight wonderful AAPI talent that you should know about and see them beyond just their career and work ethic. Now that I've relaunched Happy Hour and evolved a lot as a person over the last 2 years, I'm so excited to expand the types of topics I want to discuss with my guests. One of them being the topic of mental health, which makes me so thrilled to introduce to you my guest today, who is an expert in this field. So today we are speaking with Dr. Elizabeth Nguyen, who is not only a psychiatrist, but an artist, author, and a water healer, which we'll get to very soon. She received her BA in Human Biology from Stanford University and her psychiatry residency and child psychiatry fellowship training at UC Davis, which is where she currently lives right now. Her specific skill sets now include cross-cultural psychiatry, the intersection of spirituality and mental health, and the healing power of water and the natural world. Last December, Dr. Nguyen released a book called Aloha Vietnam. It's a fiction novel about an immigrant Vietnamese family navigating their life in America while grappling with the foreign topic of mental health when a young family member is diagnosed with bipolar disorder. So Dr. Nguyen, welcome to Happy Hour. I hope I did you justice by naming out all of your achievements to the best of my ability, but welcome.
Thank you so much, Melissa. You did an excellent job introducing me, better than I could have myself. I'm so happy to be here.
Likewise. And I was just speaking to you before we started recording on how we got connected. Your publisher reached out and sent an email on a sunny Sunday afternoon. And when I read the email, I was like, oh my goodness, yes, it's not only API month, it's also Mental Health Awareness Month. So let's get a session in super quickly. I had the pleasure of reading your book, Aloha Vietnam, before our conversation here today. And I'd love to structure our discussion by drawing from certain parts of your book and then bringing up mental health topics in relation to stuff that was talked about in your book that I'm sure most people would love to learn more about. I highly recommend reading this book, and just a really poignant discussion about mental health for first-gen families, immigrant families. So I want to start with the prologue. And in the prologue, it immediately starts with the main character, a 17-year-old girl. Ang, is that how I pronounce her name?
Ang On, yeah.
Ang, okay, Ang. So she experiences her first manic episode at the age of 17. From someone in your professional experience, how do you describe mania?
Mania, as described sort of by the DSM, which is the Diagnostical Statistical Manual of Psychiatry, which describes mania as a constellation of symptoms, usually seen with a shift in mood, like an elevation or an irritable mood, pressured speech, increased energy, difficulty focusing, rapid thoughts that aren't usual to your normal sort of daily consciousness, trouble keeping your thoughts, maybe increased impulsivity, inhibition, increased sexuality and spending. So that's sort of the textbook definition of mania. But there, this whole book and our conversation today will dive into what actually is mania, what actually is bipolar. Like, how does someone going through a mental health challenge make sense of these diagnoses? And that's really what's more interesting and relevant to humans going through this experience.
And you were talking about the DSM, which is this very dense sort of textbook where it defines a lot of mental illnesses. And I was wondering, for the topic of mania, do you think the DSM is up to date on diagnosing what mania is?
The DSM gets updated all the time, and the DSM-5 is pretty up to date. It's like a couple years out. But the DSM, which is like a group of experts in the mental health field, it's a group of experts who sit around and decide how to define mania and how to define bipolar disorder. And it's a thick book that tries to describe mental illness by description. But it doesn't really necessarily, it's not the truth. It's not a definitive truth on what is going on. It doesn't explain why. It doesn't necessarily explain how. It's a descriptive manual. So it is very helpful. It is very helpful because in dealing with mental health and mental illness, it's important to be able to speak with other people about these things. But I think it's only the beginning. The DSM is only the beginning of unpacking mental health and mental health experiences.
Yeah. It's a great starting point, but it can't be taken to the fullest extent because it is also a textbook written by experts who may not be experiencing certain types of those mental illnesses. So that's also something to keep in mind as well. And in this book, our main character, when she exhibits her first manic episode, she's then brought to a psych ward and she is diagnosed with bipolar disorder. Can mania and bipolar disorder be mutually exclusive, or do they come in hand?
They can be mutually exclusive. So mania, again, is a description of a state of being, and mania can be caused by bipolar disorder, but it can also be caused by substance use, by medications, by steroids. So mania is oftentimes the most common cause of mania is a bipolar or psychotic episode, but it's not mutually exclusive to that.
And to speak on the other side of mania, which is of bipolar disorder, your mood is completely the opposite. Can you describe a bit more of what someone with bipolar disorder could be feeling when they're not in a state of mania?
Yeah, so actually most people with bipolar disorder are more commonly in the depressed states. Bipolar meaning you can swing between a depressed episode and a manic or mixed episode where you might have some of both. So a depressed state is more common, what we know of, someone who's depressed, who's feeling sad, down, feeling really low, having thoughts of not wanting to be alive or wanting to take their life, having really low energy, low motivation, low concentration, having a lot of negative critical thoughts about themselves, not eating well, not sleeping well, having changes in all those sort of physical symptoms as well. So most times bipolar is found in people who've had depression over time, and then they when they end up having a manic episode is when it becomes bipolar disorder rather than just unipolar depression.
One common symptom, I guess, of having bipolar disorder is having vivid dreams. Could you speak more upon what are those vivid dreams that people with bipolar disorder might be having?
Yeah, vivid dreams or vivid dream life, I have found, is actually not exclusive to bipolar. A lot of humans who don't have mental health issues have it, but then a lot of people who've had trauma or are dealing with some psychologically, emotionally distressing material that they're trying to process do have vivid dreams. And in the book, I talk about, this is, my orientation as well, that our dream life is a really important communicator to us about what is going on in our unconscious that our psyche is trying to work out. I think emotionally and psychologically distressing material that we're trying to process often shows up in our dream life. And, especially in trauma, where that's sort of the classic, having nightmares or flashbacks in our dream life is, in PTSD, that is the extreme sort of example of, vivid dreams being related to a mental health diagnosis.
Yeah. Interpreting dreams in general is a very difficult task to do. And in the book, the main character on, she comes to her doctor and she has a lot of these dreams that she's having and shares with the doctor. And it's very interesting to see the process of how the doctor guides on through those dream sequences. Is that something that you also do in your practice? And how do you go about diagnosing, or I guess contextualizing something that is, I mean, not in our world, but something that's so internal and happens in our sleep?
I do use dream analysis quite a bit in my practice. And that really came from me when I was in therapy. My therapist, she was a psychoanalyst. She used dream analysis quite a bit in her analysis and practice with me. And so that's where I kind of experienced it and found it so helpful. And I would say that dream analysis and psychotherapy and really mental health treatment is really more of an art sometimes than just a clinical diagnosis, medications, and treatment. This is where I feel that true healing comes from, is in really trying to understand the person in front of you. So you can say, I'm having nightmares, check box, clinical, criteria for PTSD. But how much is that really going to tell me about what is actually going on in the person in front of me? When I ask someone, well, tell me more about your dreams, like what is actually going on? What are you feeling? Who's in it? What's happening? I get to explore someone's inner world. We have no control over our dream life, which is why we often call it sort of the window into the unconscious, because we can't control our dreams. So this material is coming from somewhere that we don't consciously control. So sometimes it gives us a really valuable window into what we might be thinking and feeling and fearing and desiring without us having control over it. Sometimes when you come to therapy and you're like, oh, just, tell me what's going on. We already have some sort of like a prepackaged idea of, oh, this is what I want to talk about in therapy. This is what I think is going on, which is all very helpful because dealing with the conscious material is so helpful. But the dream life is so fascinating because it's unconscious material that we're being presented with, oftentimes so rich. And it's sort of like we get to really explore what might be going on that we haven't really allowed ourselves to think about and to see.
How long has the study of dream analysis been around for?
I would say Carl Jung probably was one of the first people to delve into it. And I'm not a historian, so I don't really know historically, but I would say at least 50 years, 50 to 100 years of dream analysis. But that's in the modern psychotherapy world, right? If you look back at indigenous cultures, who often had people who had visions, who were known to have visions and receive wisdom and guidance from their dream life. I think this practice of honoring the wisdom that comes from our dream life probably stretches back to the beginning of human history. But the modern sort of dream interpretation analysis has probably been, we've had a different language for it in the last 100 years.
Are you someone that also dreams a lot? And I'm curious, since you do have this, you do practice dream analysis, like do you analyze your own dreams as a psychiatrist?
I do have a very vivid and active dream life. And the more I pay attention to it, the more active it becomes. Like if I make a point to try to remember my dream from the last night and even jot down a few notes about it in the morning, it's almost like I get into a habit of like paying more attention to it. And then there's more material. I tell anyone who's interested in understanding their dreams, and even with my patients, is you yourself are the expert on your dream life. Like, don't let anyone else tell you what your dream means or how to analyze your dream. Sometimes it's helpful to get feedback from other people who know you, especially maybe a therapist who's holding space for your healing journey and who might have some ideas of how things might fit together. But you ultimately are your own expert on your own inner life and your dream world.
Yeah. I love how you said that dreaming is something to exercise, like it's a muscle. For me, I don't really remember my dreams that much, or but my two other close friends, they are constantly flexing their dream muscles. Like they love to tell me what they dreamed about, kind of dissecting what their dreams mean. I'm not at that level, maybe yet.
I would say the emotional tone you feel in your dreams is probably the most important
For sure.
message that you're getting. Yeah. All the other details are just like a movie.
Okay, so speaking of movies, I want to bring up about how you described An's treatment once she gets put in the psych ward for the first time. When we see movies and shows, and even in books as well, a manic patient, someone who is experiencing a manic episode, they get treated pretty aggressively. And especially in the book, it's like she gets, pressed down, and then there's like this really long needle that's about to be injected in her butt. And so how real is that? Like how is that in the real world?
That is pretty accurate. And it's something most people don't know about, which is why I felt so called to write this book, is to share a window into what mental health treatment is really like on an inpatient setting and on an outpatient setting. So as a psychiatrist, I get to witness all of this. And I really do know that it's a world that most people don't really get to see or really understand, except for the people who are in it. And I know that psychiatric hospitalization can be so traumatizing for so many people, especially anyone, but especially adolescents. And the descriptions of treatment in this book, I would say, are like 100% accurate of what I've witnessed and seen, and what I've had a lot of patients and family members describe to me as their experience of what it feels like to be on their side. Obviously, everyone has a different experience, but I think sometimes it can be brutally honest to see, like, wow, is this what a psych ward looks and feels like? And is this what it feels like to be diagnosed and medicated? And I would say yes.
Has treatment been moving towards a direction that's more quote unquote humane?
Yeah. So I would say that the inpatient setting, which is where some of the more brutal sort of, restraints and involuntary use of medications remain, unfortunately, quite similar, because in that setting of being in a state where you're said that you're not capable of making decisions for yourself. You're either, a danger to yourself, you're a danger to others, or you're gravely disabled. The measures needed to stabilize you are quite extreme. So I would say the inpatient settings are probably still quite similar. There is an evolution in the outpatient treatment world, though. There is more of a slowly evolving approach to seeing patients as individual humans and not just as a DSM diagnosis. But I would say we still have a lot of work to do to make mental health treatment feel more humane, which is one of my missions with this book as well, is just to open these conversations. First of all, we need to see what is currently going on. What is the state of mental health prevalence, treatment, and experience going on, so that we can improve and evolve from that. But if we don't even talk about it, if we don't even bring any of this into the light and into the conversation, like so much goes on behind closed doors in treatment rooms and families that we don't even have an opportunity to see what we can continue to improve on.
And for mania, you said that at times it could be triggered by certain environmental factors like substance abuse. It could be family history. Can mania also be triggered by no explanation? Could it just come to someone and everyone's like, how did this happen?
Yes, I would say that it's possible that all of a sudden someone could just sort of out of nowhere like have a manic episode. I would say though that most of the time it seems like it comes out of nowhere, but once you like have it and then you actually look back and you kind of look back now with a different lens, you can see the signs that were leading up to it in terms of increasing stress or environmental factors, or like, oh, I was feeling kind of, not quite myself for the weeks or months, or there was that time, like 6 months ago or a year ago that I couldn't quite explain either. So I would say sometimes it feels like it totally catches you off guard, but after it, with a little more sensitivity, you probably can look at the warning signs that led up to it.
Yeah. For me, well, I'm very grateful that I think my mental health is still good, pretty positive. But for me, I have PCOS, and what a lot of experts say about PCOS is that like there is no cause; it just comes at you. And in a way, I don't believe that's fully true because I think there has to be a cause for everything. And I think it's only until I got my diagnosis early this year when I started to connect the dots looking backwards where I thought maybe it was certain lifestyle choices, health choices in college that led me to here. Maybe it was family issues or family genetics I meant that might have compounded over the years. And that's why it suddenly, appeared out of nowhere, which I don't think
I
is the
completely
best
agree with you.
explanation.
Completely agree with you that nothing just completely shows up out of nowhere in our physical bodies and in our mental, emotional health. Our physical bodies and our mental health are such sensitive manifestors of whatever is going on. And we may not always understand what caused the manifestation of something, but there's always a cause and effect of sort of a cascade of different, genetic vulnerability, environmental factors, nutrition, just a whole bunch of different things that always come together to lead to something. And I'll share with you that I was diagnosed with PCOS in my mid-20s.
Oh my gosh, sisters.
Let me tell you about it though, because this might help you.
Okay.
When I was like in a very stressful period of time in my medical training, and I was, thinking about starting a family. So I just wanted to kind of go to an endocrinologist and kind of talk about why I was having irregular periods. And they did an ultrasound and they did find that there were all these cysts in my ovaries. And again, there was no explanation for it, but they were like, yeah, you might have this, because I had always had irregular periods up to then. But then I just didn't have any problems getting pregnant, so I kind of forgot about it. And then, fast forward to now where I don't have PCOS. I have super regular periods. I don't have any cysts in my ovaries. And I really think that my body, my hormones at that time were responding to environmental stressors that, I could have a genetic predisposition to, but that are clearly not manifesting right now. And PCOS, again, I'm not an expert on it, but I think it's a description similar to mental health descriptions. It's polycystic ovarian syndrome, just like bipolar disorder. It's a description of things that your body and psyche are manifesting, but they don't really know what is the cause of these things. And so your body and psyche have a whole bunch of different ways of possibly manifesting distress. I think, when we are not well, when something's off balance, when something is stressing us out too much to a point where something has to give, our body and psyche show up in different ways, in our ovaries or in our mania or in our skin rash or in our GI system and our headaches. And it's a bit of a mystery exactly why something manifests a certain way or not. But I think the real question is, okay, what is going on? What is my body and psyche trying to tell me? And let's try to get to the bottom of it so I can be balanced and well again.
Yeah, that's so amazing to hear your perspective, and from someone who had PCOS. I completely agree. I think when a woman goes to an endocrinologist or a gynecologist and they're talking about how their periods are irregular or they're just feeling a bit more depressed because of a lot of these symptoms that show up that make them feel less confident. At times, like a doctor will just prescribe them a birth control pill and an antidepressant. And a lot of these male doctors, and for me as PCOS, I get a lot of recurring yeast infections because of my gut imbalance. And and there was this doctor who was like, oh, it's like a part of womanhood. I'm like, you're saying getting yeast infections every month is a part of womanhood? Anyway, that was really great to hear that you are, feeling even better than before. And that's super inspiring to hear.
Yeah, I suffered from irregular periods throughout my adolescence and young adulthood that I look back now on, and I think were really related to stress and hormonal, just hormonal stressors of emotional, unprocessed emotional stuff going on in my family that I did not know how to process. And now that I have, I don't suffer from any of those symptoms.
In your practice, what would you say are the most common mental health issues you've seen in your clients, let's say over the past 10 years?
I would say we have a pandemic of anxiety. Like everyone is anxious, from our little kids to our adolescents, to our young adults, to our middle-aged adults, to our seniors. We have a pandemic of anxiety in our society and culture. We have a lot of depression, have a lot of stress, and we still do have, the more severe mental illnesses of psychosis and mania and substance use. And we have trauma. We have a lot of trauma as well. But I would say that everyone I meet has anxiety, and whether it's clinically significant, causing a dysfunction or not is more nuanced. But everyone I know is super stressed and anxious, which lets me know that something is going on socially and culturally. This is not just, there's a rising prevalence of DSM diagnoses of anxiety that, all of a sudden, who knows what's going on? There just is. It's like, oh no, there's something bigger going on in our society that we need to take a look at in terms of modern living. Why is everyone super anxious?
Yeah, that's something that I like listening to this podcast by Emma Chamberlain, and she recently had a guest expert talk about how we're living in an age of indulgence, and people who experience anxiety or depression, you see a higher ratio of that in wealthier nations. And she coined it as the plenty paradox. I think it's so interesting that even though your circumstances may seem great, you have maybe a really good family background or your job is going great, anxiety, depression still will creep in. And even to people who we think are mentally fit, are mentally all right. And a lot of my peers, people in their 20s, 30s, even in their teens, they're always talking about, I'm just such an anxious person. I'm such an anxious person. Or I think it's just so interesting. There's like this gray area where I think a lot of people in my Gen Z, cohort, this is just an observation. We like to toss around the word anxiety, depression, or, oh, that was such a traumatic experience. It's like you go to a Trader Joe's, your favorite snack is not there. You're like, oh my gosh, that was such a traumatic experience. So, what do you make of that? Like, does everyone have trauma now? Like, what is trauma?
Yeah. So thank you for just kind of bringing in the sort of generational context of your generation. There is such an increasing, even though there still is stigma around mental health and mental illness, I do think there is increasing comfort in talking about mental health and depression and anxiety and trauma. But there can be almost like a swing to really just throwing around these words like too trivially, to really kind of feeling like, oh yeah, like, like that example you showed of, it was traumatizing that my favorite Taki chips weren't at Trader Joe's, which, I think is funny, it's facetious. But trauma is again, it's a big term to unpack, and no one owns the sort of expert on it. But I like to think of it as trauma is anything that overwhelms our nervous system to a degree that we can't manage it. So to a sensitive person, something that is not necessarily traumatic to another person, it could be traumatic to them. So I don't think, sometimes people tell me like, oh yeah, I never did have any of these major traumatic events like abuse or assault or, a natural disaster in my life. So I don't think I've really experienced any trauma. But then when I actually hear about how they experienced even just the emotional climate of their upbringing or experiences of being isolated or rejected, or how deeply they felt disappointments in their life, it did feel like they did have traumatic experiences that at the time they just didn't know how to process. It overwhelmed their nervous system, either causing them to either shut down or completely kind of like bolt. And that sort of trauma lives in their body, and it lives in their psyche as that was a traumatic experience for me. Like, I'm thinking back about something like in second grade where I won sort of this prize in my second grade classroom, which involved me being able to like go into the Halloween booth and get to look at a prize or something. And so I was like a young, very sensitive, shy 7 or 8-year-old, and I went back into this dark booth and I couldn't get the prize box to open. And I felt so embarrassed and so ashamed for some reason, but I never went to ask the teacher, like, I don't know how to open this prize box. I just kind of pretended that, oh yeah, I went into the Halloween booth and I got my prize. But actually, it was kind of a traumatizing experience to me to realize like how ashamed and embarrassed I was of like telling someone I didn't know what to do, telling a teacher, because, I was like, a good student, that I didn't know what was going on. So was that trauma on a scale of like a natural disaster? No, but I did find it kind of traumatizing. So I think, again, the same way I talked about you are the expert in your dream life, your inner world, use the word trauma, not just throwing it around, but you get to define what was traumatizing for you. And as long as you're using it thoughtfully and respectfully, it's usually a window into something that you are working through.
I'd like for you to read a passage in the book, and it does speak about trauma and sorrow and the power of water, which is where I want to guide our conversation to. So page 97.
Okay, awesome. So this is, again, I wrote the book from the daughter Aang's perspective and the mother Swan's perspective, and this chapter is from the mother Swan's perspective. When I look out at the ocean, I imagine my ancestors looking back at me across the Pacific Ocean from the shores of Vietnam. I can feel the sadness in the water and the sorrow in my heart. I wonder if I will ever see Vietnam again, my motherland, the place where I was born and raised. Our family was lucky to be able to leave Vietnam safely, but I didn't even have a chance to say goodbye. I think about the thousands of my fellow countrymen and women who died as boat people trying to leave Vietnam, how their bodies were lost in the waves of the Pacific Ocean as they had tried to escape war and poverty to find a new home to establish their lives. The dark waters of this ocean still hold their pain, their trauma, their tears, the stories of their unlived lives echoing like ghosts underwater. And the ones who survived, like me, are now living out our own broken lives on land, trying to piece together a new story that never feels quite whole or complete.
So water is a very strong motif in the book. It's one of the main, I feel like it's one of the important characters. It comes up when we talk about just now the passage across the Pacific Ocean, as Aang's parents are trying to leave Vietnam as refugees. And it talked about the refugees that died at sea, or in a more positive light, it would talk about water when Aang would boogie board in as an adolescent when she lived in Hawaii. How do you coin yourself as a water healer?
Yeah, so I have a multidimensional relationship to water that I really have had with me my whole life and maybe many lifetimes. But it's taken a while. It's taken my own journey and my own process, especially because I'm a Western trained psychiatrist, to really be able to confidently and truthfully say, I'm a water keeper, and I use water as a healing modality by helping people tune in to the energy and the wisdom and healing powers of water. I do it for myself and I do it for my patients. So it is an important part in this book. And there's so many different things to unpack about it. Water is one of those elements where, yeah, like we scientists can study it, and we can, break apart its chemical, molecular properties and understand how it moves and all of its unique properties scientifically. But there's also such an undeniable truth that water is the main element on our planet and in our bodies that causes and is the main reason we are alive. Water, like we would not be alive unless there is the element of water powering just even the motion of our planet, the tides, the pull of the moon, and bringing water to the plants that grow, that feed food for our animals and humans. Scientists try to explain things, but there's also this it doesn't need to be explained that water is at the source of what life is. And this is where so much of indigenous wisdom of not just humans, but indigenous wisdom of earth-based living know that water is such an important element in keeping life well and healthy and balanced. So if you can really listen to water and really understand how water works, how to keep it healthy and clean and flowing and moving in the way that is most harmonious to an ecosystem, whether it's your body or a landscape or a community or globally, then you're going to understand how to be in balance and harmony. You're going to understand what's off and what needs to be rebalanced. But as far as practically speaking, like how do I incorporate it into my clinical practice and with my patients, both psychiatry patients and my water healing clients, is really tuning in to how energy flows in your own body. And so many Eastern traditions of wellness, like acupuncture or Tai Chi or Qigong, or even, just body work and the chakra systems, they all are talking about the same thing, which is there is a way that energy moves in our physical body, in our cells and in our tissues. So when you can actually kind of tune in to that sort of water map in your body of where energy is and how it's flowing, you can really work to restore the proper balance and flow of energy in your body. And I teach patients how to do that by tuning into their body. Again, it's all about paying attention, your physical body, your inner world, your energy, your water, and learning how to get those signals and feedback so that you can become your own healer and you can understand like what is going on, what do I need to pay attention to, what needs to be tended to. And our physical body gives us a lot of those signals through the aches and pains we feel or the symptoms we have.
That's so fascinating hearing you explain the healing power of water and your role as a water keeper, because there's definitely so many things that we cannot explain with science. And I think for me as a spiritual faith-based person, I think there are so many untapped energies that we just scientifically cannot explain in a book, that we scientifically at times cannot put into words. So hearing you say that, how, water has certain energy, that does make sense to me. And if water has been around forever.
Since the beginning of time, since the beginning of life, it has.
Then it has to have some sort of power. But that being said, because you also have, one foot more in this spiritual healing realm, you also have another foot in more of the scientific Western mental health realm. What do your peers within the more scientific mental health community have to say about more of the spiritual or energy water healing practices that you do?
I love talking about this because this is really my role to navigate. Again, I think I've always had this multidimensional connection to water. But then I went the traditional route of going to medical school and becoming a Western trained MD. But as I had my own spiritual, awakening and development alongside of that path, I really wrestled. With how do I hold both of these together? And it was a journey that I really wrestled with, and I walked every step of that wrestling match, at times feeling like, oh, do I need to even leave psychiatry? I even thought about, do I need to leave psychiatry because I can't really honor everything that I know to be true just because, my profession and my licensing says that it's not evidence-based, or there's no research on it. So in the end, if anyone who's interested in healing, obviously we want to make sure that we're acting in the best ethical integrity. You don't want to just go to a quack who says they're a healer and is not going to treat you with integrity. But for myself, I learned at some point that if I just treat my psychiatry patients the way that I was trained to with this DSM and these medications, I'm not really healing the patient in front of me. And I feel an ethical dilemma there. I feel that, yes, I won't get sued, or I'm doing everything that my evidence-based practices tell me to do, but I'm not really healing this person in front of me. And I feel an ethical dilemma about that. And that's where I struggled with, well, do I kind of let my license go then so I can incorporate more healing, more, these other elements that I think are more healing into clinical practice? But as I continued that sort of wrestling journey, my own guidance kept telling me, no, you're not supposed to just reject psychiatry and reject the Western model, because there is, at this time on the planet, we still need that. We still need that knowledge and scientific information as well. We need both, and we need you to do both so you can give legitimacy and credibility to both worlds. Because I also feel that some people who are too only into the spirituality and the energy and all that and completely reject the Western models, they can if they want. But, I also see suffering there. I see a lot of suffering with completely rejecting modern medical care that can be at times very useful and helpful.
Absolutely.
So it's how can we honor both as modalities and as, attempts to provide healing? Science is just another way of trying to understand the truth of what is going on. And I would say that, spirituality is also trying to understand the truth of what is going on. And they're not opposed to one another. Mm-hmm. They just use different paradigms and methods. So if we don't polarize the issue and really respect that we are all trying to understand the truth of what is going on so that we all can be better balanced and well, not only for ourselves and our communities, but our planet needs all of us to work together. The more we fight about who's right and wrong, the less we actually are trying to understand what is actually going on.
Would you be open to sharing more about your personal mental health journey? Because from this book, I'm assuming it's also drawing a lot from your own personal and family experiences. For example, Ang's parents in the book, your parents were also refugees from Vietnam who immigrated to Honolulu in 1975 at the end of the Vietnam War. So that's what we know as the fall of Saigon. And that's when the capital, when Saigon, now known as Ho Chi Minh City, it fell into the hands of the North Vietnamese army. So could you tell me more about what parts of the book were drawn experiences from your family and from your upbringing, and the reason why you decided to go into the realm of clinical psychiatry and mental health healing?
Absolutely. So people often ask me, we know this book is so personal, Liz. How much of the book is autobiographical and how much is fictional? And I would say that it's 50-50, that there is 50% autobiography in here, and that I did come from a Vietnamese American refugee family. I was born and raised in Hawaii. I went through that experience of what it was like to be in an immigrant family in a new land and a new culture. There was mental health challenges and mental illness in my family and in family members. And I myself have experienced, depression and anxiety. And then a lot of the scenes of treatment come from my experiences being a psychiatrist. I took all of that personal stuff, but I made the story fictional. Like the characters themselves are fictional. That what happens to them wasn't exactly what happened to anyone in my family because it's fiction. I myself did not go through a bipolar journey. Family members of mine have, but I really wanted to make it fictional because I really wanted to honor that creative spirit. There was a creative spirit that wanted to come through in this book that really wanted to create a story that almost anyone could see themselves in, that like they could relate to, maybe not all of it, but some of it. It was sort of like a sort of a personal and an individual story of Aang, but I really wanted to create, the energy of it was I really wanted to create something that anyone could relate to. But so much of my own personal experiences growing up in, a refugee family, especially now as a psychiatrist, I reflect on it and it's so rich. It's so multidimensional in that growing up, I always thought like my mom, like she has an anxiety disorder. Like she's really anxious all the time. And then I have anxiety. I have an anxiety disorder. And now that I've done so much healing work around all of this, I really question like, is this really anxiety or is this so much trauma? This is like unprocessed trauma and disruption to life's experiences and stories in terms of course, my mom who grew up in Vietnam in a time of war, in a time of conflict, and then all of a sudden in the course of a week has to leave everything familiar and start over in a new place where she doesn't know the language and she doesn't know the culture and she has to raise her children. Of course, she's gonna be a little stressed and worried about, can I do this? Like, what am I doing? Can I handle this? Am I doing things am I going to be okay? And maybe she met the DSM criteria for anxiety at some point, but it also on a human level context, it makes complete sense that someone going through all of that would have some of the symptoms of anxiety that, I inherited just kind of growing up around that. But as we've done more healing work around just understanding our human journey and experience, I'm really, questioning, like, sometimes it's helpful to use the words anxiety and anxiety disorder. And then sometimes it's also helpful just to kind of take it into context of human experience and struggles and common ways we all struggle. But, I definitely would say that I did have anxiety throughout my childhood. I was very shy. I was super nervous. I would worry a lot. My father, who again on some DSM diagnosis criteria would have OCD, but he was just always, he had to make sure everything was done a certain way, and that put a lot of pressure on me to feel like I had to do everything a certain way. So maybe at some point I could have been diagnosed with some obsessive compulsive traits too. But as I've done this healing work, I'm like, no, actually, I don't have OC. That's not who I am. I'm not an anxious OC person. All of this has been like environmental influences that I understand from a different lens. So yeah, those are some of the ways that like I myself have experienced it with my family members and try to make sense of it from both the Western and the more humanistic models.
Yeah. Not a lot of what I learned in your book, not a lot of Vietnamese immigrants immigrated to Hawaii in the 70s. And they usually went to, I think they went to like Wisconsin. That was one of the states you talked about. Why wasn't Hawaii a more popular option?
Well, Hawaii was just a small state in general. The population wasn't very big, so it wasn't a huge resettlement base for refugees where like Camp Pendleton in California or other refugees resettlement camps in bases in America like Wisconsin or Minnesota or Ohio, Hawaii. The only reason my family ended up in Hawaii was because my aunt, my paternal aunt, Auntie Nina, she had left Vietnam in the 60s and had married an American military officer who was stationed. So she
Mm-hmm.
had left Vietnam early, also kind of uncommon. And so she and my uncle Bruce were already living in Hawaii, and they said, we will be sponsors for this family. So when you leave Vietnam as a refugee, you either have to find a sponsor, or if you don't have anyone sponsoring you, they're just going to send you to these resettlement refugee bases where they will look for a sponsor for you. And Hawaii was not one of those resettlement bases for a variety of
Mm.
reasons. It was just a stroke of luck or divine destiny. I often say that my family won the refugee lottery to end up in Hawaii. Like, I loved growing up in Hawaii, and being a refugee and immigrant has its challenges anywhere, but having the natural world of Hawaii to receive us during that transition was really such a gift.
And I wanted to also just talk more about your parents, because in the book, the father, Long, he worked as a parking attendant for a while, and then Aang's mom, she worked at a nail salon, and then eventually they pooled together what little money they had to buy a souvenir shop. What did your parents do when they came to when they came to Hawaii?
Yeah, that part actually is more true. I have a lot of gratitude and respect for my parents, who were educated. They were both educated in Vietnam. My dad studied abroad in Australia and had an economics degree, and my mom was a math teacher in Vietnam. But when they had to move to Hawaii and literally start over with like no money, their first jobs were anything they could find. And my mom didn't work in a nail salon. She did work at the pineapple factory. That was true.
Mm.
She worked at the Dole pineapple factory. But she did develop a rash to the pineapple juice, and that was why she couldn't continue that. And then so she became a sales girl in Waikiki, working at, one of those tourist shops in Waikiki,
So
just as a
Her English had to progress working as a sales girl.
yeah, she did not know much
Wow.
English at all working in Waikiki as a sales girl, but it had to progress, just like the environment made it progress. My father did have excellent English because he studied abroad in Australia, and he was already in America when Saigon fell. He was actually on a Vietnamese government sponsored business trip to Washington, D.C., to study the economic policies of America, to eventually bring it back to Vietnam. But we learned that the U.S. backed South Vietnamese government was going to pull out and Saigon was going to fall, it's not going to be possible for my father to return to Vietnam unless he wanted to be sent to re-education camps. So he just made arrangements for my mom to come to Hawaii along with my aunt and my uncle and my grandmothers and my oldest sister, who's really a cousin. My oldest sister came, but just like any immigrant sort of rags to riches story, they really did just start by becoming a sales girl and then being like, you know what? I don't want to be. Vietnamese people are very entrepreneurial. They don't like working for other people. Everyone wants to be their own boss. Even if you go to Vietnam now, like even if there's standard of living sometimes can be low and people are poor, everyone is their own boss. Like everyone owns their own like noodle stand or soy milk shop. Everyone loves being their own boss. So I think my mom had that in her, where she's like, I don't want to work my butt off and give all the money to this owner. Like, I want to open my own souvenir Waikiki shop. And that's what she and my dad did. And they just worked really hard at it.
Yeah. I want to wrap up our conversation by just bringing it back to your growth just as a person over the past few decades, because you say that you do have a family now. You have two children, and also being a daughter of Vietnamese immigrants, as coming from a refugee family, there's a lot of generational customs that get passed down. There's a lot of generational trauma that your parents must have felt, and there's probably a lot of trauma that maybe was passed down to you. And so with all of that in context, now it's also the time where you're passing down customs to your children. What do you think are some of the cultural customs you will choose to pass on to your kids, and what are those that you received from your parents do you choose to leave behind?
I love the opportunity to reflect on that. I think coming from an immigrant family where I think my parents really, whether they consciously thought about this question that you just asked me or not, they probably took the brunt of trying to sort through how much do we hold on to, like leaving Vietnam, coming to America. Let's just simplify that and leave out, just like how much of our Vietnamese culture do we hold on to and how much do we let our children become American? Like I think my parents, being the first generation who did that migration journey, they took the brunt of that undertaking, whether they consciously thought about it or not. And I think we, as a family, we all just had to navigate that. It was like a daily question without us even knowing it as a question. Like how much of our ancestral motherland history are we holding on to, and how much do we just have to let our new life and customs and culture take hold in us? And I know when I gave birth to my son, my firstborn son, I really struggled with, like, I was fluent enough in Vietnamese to talk to my parents in Vietnamese, but, sometimes throwing in English. But I realized I wasn't fluent enough to mother my son, my children in Vietnamese in the way that I really wanted to mother. Like, if I only used Vietnamese with them, I would basically be only telling them like when it was time to eat and clean up and like naming different foods and counting. And there was so much more in my communication with my children that I wanted to be able to articulate than I could do in this native Vietnamese language. And that was like my first sort of real situation I faced where like I felt initially like guilty or bad that I wasn't being a good Vietnamese mother by not passing on this Vietnamese language. But I eventually just had to make peace with, I don't know this language fluently enough to mother my children in America the way I want to mother them. And I just have to let that go. And it doesn't mean I'm any less of a Vietnamese mother. And so that is just one example, but I think it's one of many examples of me being okay with, I am a Vietnamese American mother, and the way that I choose to mother is going to inevitably be some things that I take from my ancestry and my own parents, but also is so much of just what I've experienced living here in America and what my children, who are their own living beings, are experiencing with their own peers and culture that I have no control or influence over. And just really like accepting that as much as I want to do certain things certain way, that I only have control over my part of it. And the part that I want to pass on, most importantly, is this acknowledgement of the continuous ancestral line and honoring of my parents and my ancestors that I think is such a big part of all Asian cultures. I want you to know, like, this is where you came from, though. And you're a continuation of this line, even as it evolves, as we all evolve. My children are an evolved next generation of my line. They're not going to be exactly like me, just like I'm not like my parents. But I want to instill that in them as an important part of being a Vietnamese. And their father's Mexican, so they're Vietnamese American, Mexican Vietnamese American. They have another ancestral stream that goes through them as biracial, bicultural as well.
Wow. That's something I think about it at times too. It's when if I do have kids, one of the things that always troubles me is that I want them to be able to speak Mandarin, because I think obviously it's the ancestral line that's very important to me. But what makes me so fearful of that prospect is that like, well, I am fluent in Mandarin, and I think I'm more fluent than, most of my friends, but it's not at a level where I can confidently speak it in a professional business setting, for example, that I can, because I have this multi-dimensional cultural background. I'm just so scared that I'm not able to mother them with perfect Mandarin, and that always makes me super insecure. Like a lot of Chinese friends are like, your Mandarin's really good. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Like, it's not at a level where I feel confident that I could completely talk to my children in Mandarin. Maybe like you said, I'll sprinkle some English in it, or I'd have to like search up terms. And I can definitely read and write it, but I have to do it pretty slowly. And that's just one of the byproducts of like growing up in a multi-dimensional background, like what you said and what you went through. So that's something that have always talked about. But it's really refreshing to hear you say that. Like, I also think it is a bit of an ego complex that you have to break down too, admitting to yourself that I don't know everything, and I think it's okay, because in the end we are all evolving, and so our circumstances are so different. Yeah, I want to kind of just end our conversation on that, and I want to thank you so much, Dr. Nguyen, for coming on Happy Hour, and for any of our listeners who are able to watch our video conversation. If you are able to see Dr. Nguyen through the video, like, your skin is so good. I have to say that.
My mom would be so pleased to hear that, because she has always told me I don't have good skin. And so I have, it's been something I've always thought, like, I don't have good skin. So thank you.
I think I don't know if this is something that you would relate to, but I feel like a lot of people who love going to the ocean, they're like, I like to take a dip in the ocean like daily. I see their skin, I'm like, there is something in the water for sure that like is reverse aging them.
There is so much healing elements and minerals in ocean water. There is. And I would say, as many Asian parents say, like, like they don't want you to go out in the sun and get too dark. Like I definitely have to take that into consideration. But, I think spending time out in water and the ocean and the sunshine is good for you, as long as you don't get sunburned and you respect the elements and their power as well.
Absolutely. Well, once again, Dr. Nguyen, I'm so grateful that we were able to speak. And for anyone who is interested in buying her book, Aloha Vietnam, I will link the book description and where you can buy in the show notes. And I'll also link any of Dr. Nguyen's work in the description as well, so you can all check out what she's up to and how you can support her. But yes, thank you so much for coming on Happy Hour. This is such a wonderful discussion that we had.
Thank you so much, Melissa. It was my pleasure to be here.
Thank you for listening to Happy Hour with Melissa Cho. Yes, that is me. If you've made it to the end of this episode, you already know the call to action. Follow Happy Hour wherever you listen to your pods. If you've been enjoying the show so far, or if you've been a long-term listener and you haven't left a review yet, you can do so by leaving a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. If you're feeling generous on Apple Podcasts and you want to leave a written review, that would be amazing as well. And also be sure to follow Happy Hour on Instagram. That is HAAPI, not HAPPI, okay? People keep spelling the name wrong, but it is HAAPI. If you spell HAPPI, then you are not an ally, and it's literally the last day of API. Okay, I'm rambling. So it's HAAPI, HOURPOD. Happy Hour Pod. That is the Instagram where you're going to be seeing episode highlights, guest reveals, and bloopers. So be sure to follow Happy Hour on Instagram if you want any of that fun content. Anyway, okay, I'll see you next week. Bye.